like your pivot points, but for different attitudes of the plane. So your lateral axis, that's your wingtip to wingtip. When you pitch the nose up and down, you're pitching about the lateral axis. Your roll from nose to tail, your longitudinal axis is the roll. That's your ailerons when you go side to side. And then your vertical axis is your yaw, top to bottom. That's your rudder. That's when the nose swings like this. So the nose is yawing about the vertical axis, you're rolling about the longitudinal axis, and you're pitching about the lateral axis.
What'd you say the lateral axis goes through?
Wingtip to wingtip.
Oh no, the center of gravity?
Yes, all three of these axes pass through the center of gravity. So center of gravity is important because that's where everything rotates around.
Thank you.
Yeah. Talk a lot about lift, angle of attack. I'm just going to say it again. The plane stalls when it exceeds the critical angle of attack. That's when the plane stalls. You do have stall speeds, but they change based on weight. They change based on if you're in a bank or not. They change based on if you have flaps down or not. If you have flaps down, you decrease your stall speed. More weight increases your stall speed. More bank increases your stall speed. So your speed changes. That's why you don't find it on the airspeed indicator. Maneuvering speed also changes with weight. That's also not on the airspeed indicator. If it's placarded, it's because they're placarding it for the max gross weight. So 1,600 pounds, maneuvering speed for the Cessna 150 is 109 miles per hour. If you're lighter than that, I don't know. But just know that's going to be a little bit slower. But the plane stalls every time when it exceeds the critical angle of attack. I think there was something I wanted to tell about. I said that it's the speed at which it stalls before it brakes. I was going to get into the why. Why that happens is because when you're flying along and you have a heavy plane, naturally you have to fly at a little bit higher of an angle of attack to keep straight and level. So you need to add a little bit more power. So you're at a higher angle of attack while you're flying straight and level. You have higher power because you're heavier weight. So you're at a high angle of attack. Let's just say here's the critical angle of attack. So you're already kind of right here. So the margin between your straight and level flight and the critical angle of attack is not very much. So you pitch back just a little bit and you'll stall. If you do a full abrupt motion, you're going to stall before anything can even brake. If you're at a lower weight and you're going super fast, lower weight, you're at a lower angle of attack. So the margin between this straight and level angle of attack and the stall angle of attack is greater. So if you're going too fast, you have a lot more travel distance before you stall. Somewhere in between there, the plane, something's going to break off because you have more distance to go in order to stall the plane first. So flying at a higher angle of attack with more weight doesn't sound like a good thing, but in this case it is because that margin between the high weight and the critical angle of attack is a little bit smaller. So before you can even get the yoke all the way back, the plane's going to stall first. It'll stall before you have a chance to rip off anything. Yeah.
What is the VA and VS?
Oh, VA is your maneuvering speed. So it increases as weight increases. VS is your stall speed, which increases also as weight increases. But your critical angle of attack always stays the same, does not change. And you have stall speeds for different configurations. So you have stall speeds that are different if you're no flaps or if you have flaps. If you have flaps, the stall speed is slower, good thing. When you fly planes with retractable landing gear, you'll have stall speeds with your landing gear out. So you'll have a VSO and a VS1. VSO, I think of it as stuff out. So your flaps are out and your gear is out. So VSO is your stall speed with everything extended. VS1, I think of the one as an I, so stuff in. So VS1 is your stall configuration when you're clean, which means your flaps are up and you have landing gear up. We don't have that option in the 150, but we're just talking about complex aircraft. So VS1, VSO, stuff in, stuff out, stall speed is different. But you will always stall when you exceed the critical angle of attack. That's when you stall the plane. So if you're ever asked by your examiner or your C5, like, hey, when's the plane gonna stall? You don't talk about speed, because it just depends. Depends on your weight, depends on your configuration, depends on if you're in a bank or not. Your answer is when I exceed the critical angle of attack. What is that? We don't know for sure. It's around 17 degrees. You don't have an what's it called? Angle of attack indicator in the plane. Some do. Some will tell you, like, it'll be like green when you're fine. It'll be orange when you're getting close to the angle of attack, critical angle of attack. Then it turns red when you're like about to exceed it, and then once you pull back even more, it stalls. Some other things. I'm gonna go back to the 4 forces of flight. So we talked about lift, talked about thrust and weight a little bit. Drag. I want to go back to the induced drag, parasite drag. Induced drag is drag that's generated when you increase lift. So every time you increase lift, you're increasing drag. It's a byproduct. That's because that lift vector, as you're generating lift by increasing the angle of attack, that relative airflow changes, and therefore your lift vector changes. If your relative airflow is here, your lift is here. If relative airflow is here, your lift goes back a little bit. That vector changes because it's always at a 90-degree angle to the relative wind. So because your lift vector is pointing backwards a little bit, you increase drag that way. It's like it's pulling the plane back. You have parasite drag, which is just drag that's generated anytime an object is moving through the air. So when the plane is on the ground, not moving, it's not generating any drag. But as soon as it starts moving through the air, it's just naturally generating parasite drag, and that's just because the shape, you have this big old weirdly shaped thing flying through the air. The way the air is interacting with the object naturally just generates drag because you have this, it's a big object going through air. You also have skin friction, which is part of parasite drag. Even though it feels and looks smooth, the surface of the plane is not totally smooth. If you got like a microscope to look at it, there are little bumps and ridges. So as the air is moving over those bumps and ridges, it's generating drag. You can't see it, but it's there.
Kind of like in a car, if you wax a car.
Yeah, so that's why you wax cars, that's why you wax planes. That's why we ask you when you fly to please clean off the leading edges of the planes because a lot of bugs are on there. Those bugs cause skin friction drag. So not only does the plane look better, it saves the paint, but I don't know, you might gain a knot or two, possibly, which might not seem, huge in the grand scheme of things, but it is nice. And that's why people, when they clean their planes, they really got to get on the bottom because that's like where all the oil and the exhaust goes. So look at any plane belly, most of the time it's like kind of black or gray. So you clean that off, plane goes faster. Maybe. You might not notice it, but it is there. Oh, and also one more thing. Weight and lift are the two opposing forces. So weight opposes lift opposes weight, thrust opposes drag, drag opposes thrust. We have lift and weight, thrust and drag. Okay. Now we're talking about performance. So these are your performance charts. Okay. We'll just do one quickly. So this is in the POH. Every POH has a performance chart. For takeoff, for your rate of climb, for your landing distances, for your cruise performance. Cruise performance you care about because you want to know how much fuel per hour am I going to burn. In this POH, it gives you very specific numbers. So max gross weight. But now POHs will give you different performance based off of your weight. This one only has max gross weight. So you just assume 1,600 pounds. Same thing for here and here. Also up here. So for your takeoff distance, for example, you have max gross weight of 1,600 pounds. Your indicated airspeed, once you're at 50 feet in the air, is 64 miles per hour. This is if you have a headwind. I always just assume zero wind. Because if you have a headwind, it's actually going to decrease your takeoff distance. I'm assuming worst case scenario, I'm just saying no wind. Your ground run is how long it's going to take to roll on the ground before you rotate. And then total to clear 50-foot obstacle, just think about it as how much distance it takes for me to roll, take off, and climb 50 feet. So it gives you two different numbers. You have a ground run and total declare 50-foot obstacle. You're just imagining that there's like a 50-foot tree at the end of the runway, in theory. And then it also talks about if you're at sea level at 59 degrees Fahrenheit, which is standard temperature, aka 15 degrees Celsius, or if you're at 2,500 feet and 50 degrees Celsius, at 2,500 feet in, Fahrenheit, but in Celsius, I think 50 degrees would be like 12 degrees, roughly 12 degrees Celsius at 2,500 feet. Then at 5,000 feet, 41 degrees Fahrenheit, 7,500 feet, and 32 degrees Fahrenheit. That's all standard temperature for those altitudes. After 7,500 feet, we don't know. So you don't take off because it's not on the chart. If you're trying to take off at 10,000 feet, it's not on the chart, so you don't know. So don't do it. You're a test pilot at that point. Same thing down here for landing. You still have the same altitudes, same temperatures. Maximum rate of climb, they do it different. They have sea level, 5,000 feet and 10,000 feet. So rate of climb, how many feet per minute are you climbing? From here to here, are you going to clear the obstacle? You know, if it's like 3 miles away, probably. But how would you know? Calculating rate of climb. Also, it's important to read the notes, always. This is if you're taking off with flaps retracted, so no flaps. This is for a hard surface runway. If you don't have those conditions, then you go down to the notes, and it says increase the distances 10% for every 35 degrees Fahrenheit increase in temperature above standard for that particular altitude. So if you're at sea level right here, and let's just say it's like 95 degrees outside at sea level, you need to increase whatever distance you're using by 10%. Because if it's hotter, it takes longer to take off. For operation on a dry grass runway, increase the distances by 7% of the total to clear a 50-foot obstacle figure. So even if you're just using the ground run, it wants you to take the total to clear 50-foot obstacle figure, take 7% of that, and add it to your ground run. And don't ask me how they came about these numbers. It's just a test pilot that did this with, you know, probably a team of like engineers and scientists, and they figured this out. Got notes down here too. This is for flaps retracted, full throttle, mixture lean to smooth operation above 5,000 feet.
Are these charts unique to each aircraft?
Yes. Yeah, I would say to like each model of aircraft. So like this is the POH for the 150J model. You might have like a 150G model, which is like an older model. Might have different takeoff landing distances. Probably not much different, but it could.
Yeah, but like this is different than like
yeah.
a 747.
Correct. Absolutely, yes. This is different than like a 172.
Yeah.
Landing distance. This is if you have full flaps, 40 degrees, power off, hard surface runway, no wind. So I personally do not land with 40 degrees. I usually do like 30, maybe 20. So my landing distance is probably going to be a little bit longer. How much longer? It doesn't have a note for that, so I think I just read somewhere it's like add 10% for every 10 degrees of flaps that you don't have at 40. So there's a lot of rules of thumb out there because it's impossible to put every single situation on these charts. So for example, if you're going to take off out of McClellan, which is 77 feet field elevation, call it sea level, I would use sea level. It's cooling down right now, but I don't think it's quite at 59 degrees. So right now it's 75 degrees Fahrenheit, so it's not 35 degrees over. But hey, let's just use it. When in doubt, use conservative numbers. It's only like 15 degrees above. So if you wanted, you could like increase the distance by 5% instead of 10%. I say use the 10%. Just worst case scenario. Use conservative numbers, that way you'll never find yourself in a pinch. So you would take like for your ground run, 735, add 10%, which is what, 73 plus 735. So it's 808.5, round up to 810 feet. So your ground run to take off, so from the time your wheels lift off, it's going to take you about 800 feet to take off. Okay, that's not a problem at McClellan, or really most places, not a problem. And again, I'm also assuming zero wind. If you have a massive headwind of 10 knots, 20 knots, sure, you could use those numbers. I just use the highest number. because I always just want to be safe and I want to expect the worst. So that's how I would do it. If you're taking off out of somewhere that's like, let's say between sea level and 2,500 feet, like Auburn. Auburn's 1,500 feet elevation. They don't have a number for that. You could interpolate, which just means you kind of take the average between the two. So like, let's just say it is average temperature. You have 735 and 910 for the ground run. Add those two together, divide them by 2. Whatever number that is, that would be your rough estimate for taking off out of Auburn. So if I do 735 plus 910, I got 1645 divided by 2. I got 822 feet, because 1,500 is like roughly in between sea level and 2,500. You could do that, or you could use the higher number. They want to see your decision making, and they want to see, hey, I'm being conservative, and I'm saying it's going to take me 910 feet. If it only takes me 800 feet, great. But what if it does take you 900 feet for whatever reason? Okay, well, I already prepared for that. And anyway, if you said 910, I would just round up to 1,000. Like, I just round up all the time. You never run out of runway that way. For your landing distance, you can do the same thing. Just know that it doesn't include like winds, but it does have a note for it where it's decrease the distances shown by 10% for each 4 knots of headwind, increase the distances by 10% for every 60 degrees Fahrenheit above standard. So hot temperature does affect your landing distance, but not as much. So that's why instead of 35 degrees, it's 60 degrees, and you increase it by 10%. If it's an increase of 30 degrees, okay, you could do 5%. It's half of 60. So some of this is like kind of using common sense and like, I don't know, basic math. And then operation on a dry grassy runway, increase your distances by 20% of the total to clear a 50-foot obstacle figure, same thing. If you're on a dry grassy runway and your ground roll is 445 because you're at sea level and it's standard temperature, okay, 20% of this number, add it to that number. Or if you're using this number anyway, add it to that number. Make sense? With that note? Just read the notes. They will performance depends on your altitude, your RPM setting. So if you're at 5,000 feet, you're burning less fuel at 2,100. You're burning 3 gallons an hour. Whereas if you're full power, for whatever reason, you're full throttle at straight level at 5,000 feet, you're burning 6.4 gallons per hour. So it depends on your RPM setting. This is assuming that you have leaned the mixture properly. So if anytime you're above 3,000 feet, you should start leaning the mixture, whether that's in your altitude on your altimeter or whether that's density altitude. If I take off out of an airport and the density altitude is 4,000 feet because it's hot, I lean it for takeoff. It's not much, but what I'll do is I'll taxi out onto the runway as long as no one's on it or no one's landing. I'll pull up on the threshold, have my feet on the brakes, I'll do full power, and then I'll sit there looking at the tachometer and the RPM needle, and I'll just lean the mixture slowly until I see just a little rise in RPMs, and then I leave it there. Honestly, I end up pulling the mixture maybe like that much out. It's very small, but I'm leaning it for best power for takeoff. And then once you get to your cruise altitude, if it's 7,500 feet, same thing. You want to lean for best power. You cruise, get comfortable, straight and level, no distractions, no traffic in the area. Take some time, slowly leaning out the mixture. If it's a knob, you can twist it. If it's a lever, you just have to pull it really slowly out. And just you're waiting for that little increase in RPMs. And it only might be like 50 RPMs. Okay, cool, leave it there. That's best power. That's what this is assuming you're leaning for. If you forget to lean the mixture and you're at 7,500 feet, I don't know what number. You're burning more fuel though than what it's saying. So it's very important to remember to lean the mixture. Because as you're up higher, you don't need as much fuel going into the engine because the air is thinner up there. So less air, less fuel is needed. Actually, if you get up really high and you leave the mixture all the way in, you might be flooding the engine to the point where the engine could quit on you, which is a problem. Yeah, so when in doubt, keep your numbers conservative. You could interpolate if you feel the need to. I really only interrelate if I know it's like almost exactly in between two numbers. If it's not, there's a way to do it. These numbers are probably going to be skewed differently anyway. And from what I've observed, it's very rare for me and two people, max gross weight, for me to get 670 feet per minute of a climb in the 150. I'll get a max with two people, 400 feet per minute. So that's what I plan for. I don't even use that number. I use 400 feet per minute. If it's just me in the 150, I can get 500, maybe 600 feet per minute, depending on how hot it is. So it's also up to you as pilots to use what you have observed of the plane and in lieu of these numbers if they're not accurate. Because they aren't always. And even when you input everything into ForeFlight and ForeFlight does all this stuff for you, ForeFlight has a note at some point in the process that does say, like, you should account for whatever you've, like, with the observed data. Because everybody knows, like, these numbers were for a brand new airplane, for a test pilot, and those conditions just don't exist anymore. So whatever you've seen the plane do, that's what you plan for. Don't assume the best, assume the worst. And if you don't lean the mixture, then these numbers don't mean anything. But yeah, I mean, on average, I would say the Cessna 150 burns about, between 5 and 6 gallons an hour. That's usually what I plan for, unless I'm at like a higher RPM setting. I usually do like 2400 RPM, 2300 RPM for cruise. Depends on how fast you want to get there. But, so yeah, I just average about, to be safe, 6 gallons per hour for my own personal calculations. When you're doing your fuel calculations, I would also deduct 1 gallon for the startup, the taxi, and the run-up. Because you're burning fuel anytime the engine's running, so you might as well deduct at least 1 gallon before you take off from your, wherever you're doing your fuel calculations, just subtract 1 immediately. Some other limitations are human factors, of course. So we've talked about I'm safe, and I just put on here 85% of general aviation accidents are caused by pilot error, unfortunately. Most of the time, it's because the pilot made a mistake. And a lot of the time, it has to do with fatigue and energy levels, but also experience. There's just a lack of experience from the pilot who thought that they could, win a battle against Mother Nature. Or they're extremely fatigued because they've been flying for a long time. Fatigue is a very real thing, especially in the airlines. You could actually file a fatigue report, which would mean that they take you off of whatever trip you're on because for whatever reason, you get a bunch of delays because the plane is broken, so you have to switch planes, or the weather wasn't what it forecasted to be, so you had to circumnavigate around the weather, that your trip took longer on top of the delay. You're a pilot, you're human, you're tired. So fatigue is super real. And then these AIM chapters are where you could find more information on these different aeromedical factors in your FAR AIM, so all in chapter 8. Hypoxia is when you have insufficient oxygen going into the tissues and blood. And there's 4 different types of hypoxia. There is hypoxic hypoxia, which just happens at high altitude. Your blood's not getting enough oxygen. I have it all written down. You have hypemic hypoxia, which if you're anemic, you don't have enough blood cells to carry the oxygen, you can get hypemic hypoxia. Also, I believe you have carbon monoxide poisoning, you can get hypemic hypoxia because carbon monoxide clings to your blood cells a lot easier than oxygen. So your blood cell will hold the carbon monoxide rather than the oxygen. So you can get hypemic hypoxia, so you don't have enough blood for the amount of oxygen available. You can have histotoxic hypoxia, which happens if you are under the influence of alcohol and drugs. You're just inhibited, your blood's just not able to carry it. And you have stagnant hypoxia, which could happen if you're pulling too many G's, which is probably not going to happen in 150. But if you guys seen those videos of people flying in fighter jets for the first time, they all pass out. They're getting stagnant hypoxia. So too much stress on the body, the blood can't flow. The blood's restricted. So hypemic, hypoxic, histotoxic, and stagnant. Those are the 4 different types of hypoxia. There's different altitudes in which you're required to, there's different oxygen requirements. So, and because we're worried about hypoxia. So if you're above 12,500 feet for over 30 minutes, required crew members must use supplemental oxygen. So over 30 minutes, 12,500, required crew members need oxygen, supplemental oxygen. If you're above 14,000 feet, required crew members have to be using it. This is in a non-unpressurized airplane, by the way. So if you're above 14,000, required crew members have to use it the whole time. If you're above 15,000, required crew members must use it. Passengers must be supplied with it. They don't have to use it. If they want to take a nap, that's fine. But you have to use it all the time above 14,000 and 15,000. FAA recommends that you have supplemental oxygen available above 10,000 feet. People get hypoxic at different altitudes. People show different symptoms. Some people, they get like really giddy and they get giggly and they just start laughing. I personally get super sluggish and very slow reaction time. There's hypoxic chambers. There's not a whole lot. I do think there's one in LA maybe that you can go to and you can sit in it and they make it hypoxic just to see how you react. It's good to know how your body reacts to hypoxia so that way you can recognize the symptoms and get down if you needed to. Yeah, so my reaction time gets really slow and I get kind of a headache. So those are just some symptoms: slow reaction time, headache, giggly, feeling dizzy, blurred vision, all symptoms of hypoxia. Get down, that could call for an emergency descent. Hyperventilation, that happens, if you have anxiety or panic. I would say normally it's not the pilot, it's like a passenger that's dealing with it. So if you're dealing with a passenger that has hyperventilation, just encourage them to talk casually with you. To slow down their breathing, just ask them about, their day or whatever you know about them. Get them to talk normally. Singing is also a thing. You can also have them sing, or, you can purse your lips as if you were going to blow out a candle and have them breathe through pursed lips to slow them down. Carbon monoxide poisoning, that could happen if there's a leak in the exhaust system or a crack in the exhaust pipe and you have the cabin heat on. Because when you have the cabin heat on, you're actually just getting hot air from around the engine blown into the cabin. So if there's an exhaust leak, you're getting that exhaust in the cabin. And you can get carbon monoxide poisoning from that. If you suspect that, like if you have symptoms, because carbon monoxide is odorless and colorless, so you can't see it. But if you start getting like a really bad headache, finding it hard to breathe, blurred vision, kind of similar with like hypoxic symptoms, turn off the cabin heat immediately. You can open the windows when you're in flight as long as you're, I would say within flap operating range. You can open the windows, open the vents. You gotta air out the plane, essentially. And I would land as soon as you can. Not like in a field at an airport, but land as soon as practical. Something else it could lead to hypoxia. It could kill you, enough of it. I was gonna say, in both of the planes, in the Piper and in the 150, we do have carbon monoxide detectors. The 4-Flight Sentry, that little white box, that is also a carbon monoxide detector. It will show up on your iPad as a notification if it detects high carbon monoxide levels. It's only happened to me once. Got down, had the plane checked out. It wasn't the girls on the flight plane. There was nothing wrong, so I don't know why it went off, but it doesn't hurt to get down and to have the plane, checked out to make sure there's no like exhaust leaks or anything like that. Disorientation is just a loss of awareness. As you probably figured out, situational awareness and self-awareness are very big things in safety when you're flying. Disorientation mostly happens if you accidentally enter clouds. So VMC into IMC. So visual meteorological conditions to instrument meteorological conditions. Entering fog or clouds, very disorienting. Suddenly you have a horizon to look at and reference for straight and level, and suddenly you don't. Your windshield just looks white, and your brain has no reference for movement. It has no reference for up and down. So if you turn your head, like, because let's say you're turning to your CFI and you're panicked, and then you turn back to the panel, your brain's like has no reference, and the liquid in your ears is still moving around, so it might feel like you're in a bank even though you're in straight and level. So disorientation is also a big killer of pilots because they accidentally enter IMC conditions, and a lot of the pilots that do enter IMC on accident are instrument rated. So just because you're instrument rated does not mean you're not prone to disorientation. If you guys go on and get your instrument rating, you'll talk more about the different types of disorientation of entering clouds, but like a couple of them. One is somatographic illusion. So like on takeoff, if you take off and you're climbing and you enter the clouds, it feels like you're tumbling backwards. So it feels like you're pitched up way more than you think. There's also something called graveyard spiral, to where, I'm trying to remember how this one happens. Because like when if you're in a long turn, like a prolonged turn, eventually the fluid in your ears kind of just settles, and it thinks that even though you're in a turn, now it thinks you're straight and level. Because it's like, oh, well, we've been in this turn for a long time, the fluid equalizes, now it feels like you're here. So you really cannot trust your body when you're instrument flying. You have to trust your instruments, and you're going to hear that a bunch of times if you get your instrument rating. But eventually, so what happens is you're in a bank, and suddenly you don't think you're in a bank anymore. So what do? You steepen the bank until you can feel it again. And then you notice, oh, I'm descending, that's weird. So you pull up and you're still in a steep bank because you thought this was straight and level, but really you're still in the bank. So you've increased bank, you're pulling up because you're also descending. By pulling up, you've actually increased the turn, and you end up just spiraling down. And a lot of people die that way. One of the Kennedys died in a plane crash, and I think it was a graveyard spiral situation. So very real disorientation. How do you prevent that? Looking at your instruments. If you accidentally enter the clouds, first thing you do, eyes inside. Don't even look outside. It's not going to help you. And you have to do some instrument training as a private pilot. You need 3 hours of a simulated hood time, or simulated IMC time, which just means we're going to put foggles on you, or like a hood to where you can't see outside, but you can only see the panel. You need 3 hours of that. It's really not enough. And usually what they advise you to do is, if you enter the clouds, well, there weren't clouds behind you, so turn around. You enter a shallow bank. It's called standard rate turn. It's usually about like maybe a 10-degree turn left or right. And you're just staring at your heading indicator. It's like, okay, I'm heading north. Well, there weren't clouds behind me, so let me turn around to south. I'll get in a standard rate turn, and for a 180-degree turn, it should take you 1 minute, in theory, to turn around. So if you just stare at your heading indicator and turn, stare at your attitude indicator, because that's kind of your artificial horizon. So those are your eyes outside. So your little window, keep the blue over the brown, and you'll be fine. Attitude indicator, heading indicator, you're turning, and then hopefully you pop out of the clouds. If you're high enough, maybe you can descend as well. There's different ways to go about it. The recommended way is just to turn around. It's like, well, there's VFR back there, so go back there. If you can, the conditions are kind of brewing for that kind of thing, but if you can, if your CFI is comfortable, have them take you over to the coast in the morning when it's still foggy, and you file an IFR flight plan and just get in some it's called actual conditions, so actual IFR, flying in clouds, see what it's like. We've talked about alcohol and drugs, so I'm not going to talk a whole lot about it. 8 hours in between drinking and performing a required crew member duty. These are all required duties. And that's all in 91-17. You have 5 hazardous attitudes, and I'll talk about them quickly because we have 3 minutes. So you have anti-authority. A situation that would arise is you're talking, ATC wants you to do something, and you're like, I'm the pilot. Oh, yeah, you do, actually. It is in the regulations that you do have to comply with ATC directions unless a safety of flight is concerned. And then you can say unable. You don't have to be mean about it. But you can say unable, because at the same time, you don't let them fly the plane for you. But if they're telling you to not fly into a military operating area, don't do it. Can you legally, technically fly into a MOA? Yes. But if they tell you to avoid it, then just avoid it. anti-authority, and the antidote to anti-authority is follow the rules. They're probably right. Most federal aviation regulations are written because there was an accident. So that rule arose because there was an accident, someone died, so they made something a rule. Then you have macho, where you just think, you know, you can handle anything, especially when you get to like, I'd say like 500 hours, people are like, okay, like I'm super experienced and skilled, and you start getting more of that macho, hazardous attitude. As a student, you're probably not going to experience that a whole lot because you're still learning, but taking chances is foolish. And then invulnerability, another attitude that arises when you get more experienced, because you've probably taken flights where you're like, ooh, I probably shouldn't have flown that day, but hey, I was fine, nothing happened. It could happen to you, it could happen to me. No one is, everyone is vulnerable and susceptible to weather, to fatigue, to hypoxia. You're not, you know, you're not above any of those things. Impulsivity, not so fast, think first. So you think you have to make a quick decision because your engine failed? Well, if you're at 6,500 feet, you've got some time. You've got like maybe 12 minutes before you actually hit the ground. So, because the planes, they glide. They don't just fall out of the sky. Take your time. It might feel like it's an urgent situation, but it's probably not. It's urgent if you're at like 1,000 feet. Okay, yeah, you kind of gotta go. But if you're at, but just remember, like if you have altitude, altitude's your friend. Take some time to troubleshoot the problem. And then resignation, I think a lot of students feel this one is like you're helpless and nothing that you do will make a difference. I promise you that by the time you solo, by the time you're getting ready for your check ride, by the time you're a new private pilot, you are absolutely not helpless, because you would not have been signed off by different people if you were. Your CFI has to sign you off, at least with Girls How to Fly, a check pilot has to sign you off, that's me. And then your DPP examiner has to sign you off. So you gotta go through 3 different people who are all confident in you, and that you're confident in your abilities to handle problems. So I promise you, you're not helpless, and you can make a difference, and you do know your shit, and you will be able to figure out the problem. But it doesn't help if you automatically default to that attitude. So some of that also comes with self-confidence. I feel like some of these, at least when I first read them, I was like, yeah, because everybody who's flying is a man. So of course they all feel these. No, we're all susceptible. Like women are always all vulnerable to all these attitudes. Maybe some more than others, you know, just socially. But don't discount any of them. And you'll experience all of these in different situations, at different times, at different experience levels. But we all have all 5 of them. Just depends on the situation. I think there's a quiz, and if I find the link, I'll send it to you guys, that you could take to figure out like what are your top ones, you know, like Myers-Briggs personality kind of thing. You'd be like, oh, I found out I'm more impulsive today than I thought I was. I think mine, I had impulsivity, invulnerability, and anti-authority, and that's the more recent one I took. I took it as a student pilot, and I had resignation, and I had impulsivity. So it also changes with your experience too. And then I just put this because I send you guys the slides, so this is just kind of like to rehash the important terms, to where you can go back into the slides and review them, go back into the video and review them, Google them, do your own research on these terms, because they'll most likely come up somewhere in your, whether it's your pre-solo knowledge test or your check ride, definitely your written test. These are good terms to be familiar with and to know and to be comfortable explaining. Yes?
Relative wind is there twice. Is there supposed
Oh,
to be something
I don't
else?
know why.
Is there a different one, like relative something else?
No.
Okay.
I was probably just copy and pasting things and then typing, and then I just forgot.
Okay.
Yeah. Or because I didn't want it to be only 3 over here and 4 over there, and I was like, aesthetically, I need it to look like this. But yeah, I don't know. If I think of another term, I'll let you know.
Can we go over some of the
Yes. Yes, please.
vector, acts?
Oh, acts in a given direction
Mm-hmm.
and has a given strength. Or magnitude was another word, but I just use strength. Yeah.
Number 5, the arm is in the distance of inches from the
Datum.
datum.
Mm-hmm.
And number 8, the center of lift / pressure is always something of your center of gravity.
Center of pressure is always aft of your center of gravity. Or behind, whatever you want to say.
Now, what are the takeaways for the center of gravity is on number 9?
Number 9, center of gravity. Oh, I would say the center of gravity is the point at which all the weight is concentrated. To call it, it's the pivot point of the airplane. Center of pressure or center of lift. They're both the same.
To exceed the maximum angle of attack?
Critical.
Critical.
Critical angle. Cool. All right, well, I'll put in the group chat that
Thank
November
you.
2nd will be the long day.